Out of every 100 pilots who first trained on the Martin B-26 Marauder in 1941, as many as 1 in 3 didn't live long enough to see combat. That's how dangerous this plane's early reputation was. It earned grim nicknames almost immediately. The quote, "Widowmaker," the quote, "Flying Coffin," and even the quote, "Flying Prostitute," because with its tiny wingspan it supposedly, quote, "had no visible means of support." At MacDill Field in Tampa, Florida, so many Marauders crashed during training that locals had a saying, quote, "One a day in Tampa Bay, so how did the US military end up with a bomber that scared its own pilots more than the enemy?" The answer starts in 1939, when the US Army Air Corps put out a call for a new twin-engine medium bomber. The requirements were ambitious. A plane that could carry a 2,000-pound bomb load over 1,000 miles, hit speeds of over 300 miles per hour, and carry a heavy defensive armament. In the late 1930s, that was pushing the limits of engineering. Glenn L. Martin, head of the Martin Company, took on the challenge. His design, the B-26 Marauder, was radical for its time. To meet the speed requirement, Martin gave it a sleek, cigar-shaped fuselage powered by 2 Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp radial engines, the same powerful engines later used in the P-47 Thunderbolt and F-6F Hellcat. To minimize drag, he fitted the Marauder with an unusually short wingspan for such a heavy aircraft, only 65 feet compared to the B-25 Mitchell's 67 feet, even though the Marauder was heavier. This gave the B-26 the highest wing loading, weight per square foot of wing, of any bomber then in service. On paper, this made sense. Smaller wings meant less drag, which meant more speed. And indeed, the B-26 was one of the fastest bombers in the world when it rolled off the assembly line, capable of cruising at 350 miles per hour, faster than some early fighters. It had powered turrets in the nose and tail, waist guns, and a dorsal turret, giving it up to 1250 caliber machine guns for defense. With twin bomb bays that could carry up to 4,000 pounds of ordnance, it was a formidable machine. But there was a catch. The short wings also meant the plane needed high takeoff and landing speeds around 120 to 140 miles per hour, compared to 90 miles per hour for the B-25. Combine that with tricycle landing gear, still new at the time, and a tendency for the nose wheel to collapse under stress, and you had a recipe for disaster. Inexperienced trainees, many with just a few dozen hours of flight time, found themselves wrestling with a beast of an airplane. If an engine failed on takeoff, the Marauder's asymmetric thrust could roll the plane into the ground before a pilot had a chance to react. The results were brutal. At MacDill Field, where hundreds of new B-26 crews were being trained, accidents became so frequent that the plane's reputation tanked almost immediately. Local newspapers began running headlines about crashes into Tampa Bay. Politicians in Congress even demanded that production be halted. Some suggested scrapping the plane entirely. Yet not everyone was convinced the Marauder was a death trap. General Jimmy Doolittle, the same Doolittle who would later lead the famous raid on Tokyo, personally flew the B-26 to prove it could be handled safely. He demonstrated that with proper training and respect for its quirks, the Marauder was a solid aircraft. The problem wasn't so much the design as the lack of experience among young pilots being rushed into service. Still, the stigma stuck. Many crews went into training expecting to die before graduation. Anecdotes from veterans recall instructors drilling students relentlessly, practicing engine-out procedures, emergency landings, and even how to belly land the bomber if the nose gear collapsed. Crews developed their own black humor to cope. Some said the Marauder's best defense wasn't its speed or its guns, but the fact that, quote, "the enemy never expected you to make it that far." So why keep the Marauder at all? The answer was performance. Once in the air, the B-26 could outrun German fighters, carry a heavy payload, and had a defensive armament that made it a tough target. It just needed time and modifications to work out the kinks. That time would come in the early combat deployments, but the Marauder's reputation as the, quote, "Widowmaker" was already cemented. By 1942, crews were flying it in the Pacific and North Africa, and the aircraft was about to prove that first impressions don't always tell the whole story. When the B-26 Marauder entered combat in early 1942, its reputation as a, quote, "Widowmaker" was already infamous. But in war, reputation mattered less than results. The question was simple. Could this bomber actually perform on the battlefield, or would it kill as many American crews as the enemy? The first combat use came in the Pacific during the defense of Midway Island. just a handful of B-26s participated, attacking the Japanese fleet with torpedoes, a mission they weren't originally designed for. The results were grim. Several were shot down in their attack runs, and others came back riddled with bullet holes. But pilots noted something. The Marauder could take punishment. Even heavily damaged aircraft often managed to limp back to base. It wasn't indestructible, but it was tougher than its reputation suggested. The real turning point came in North Africa, starting in late 1942. Flying out of bases in Tunisia and Algeria, B-26s began bombing German supply lines, airfields, and troop concentrations. At first, tactics were clumsy, low-level attacks that exposed the bombers to heavy anti-aircraft fire. Losses were high. Crews felt like their grim nickname was justified. But as the US Army Air Forces adapted, shifting to medium-altitude precision bombing, the Marauder started to shine. One major advantage was speed. With its twin Pratt and Whitney R2800 engines, the Marauder cruised at around 315 miles per hour, faster than the British Blenheim, faster than the American B-25 Mitchell, and even faster than some early German fighters like the Bf-110. Enemy pilots often had only a brief window to intercept, and the Marauder's defensive guns made those attacks costly. By mid-1943, squadrons reported that loss rates were dropping dramatically, in some cases lower than any other bomber in service. So what about the training accidents? Engineers had been listening. By 1943, Martin had lengthened the Marauder's wingspan from 65 to 71 feet, reducing the wing loading and making takeoffs and landings less treacherous. Larger fins and rudders improved stability. Crews also received more specialized training before getting behind the controls. These fixes didn't erase the nickname, but they changed the reality. In combat, the Marauder was no longer a widowmaker, and statistics prove it. By the end of the war, the B-26 actually had one of the lowest loss rates of any American bomber, about 0.3% per mission. Compare that to the B-17 Flying Fortress, which had about a 0.6% loss rate, or the B-24 Liberator, which sometimes lost 50 aircraft in a single raid over Germany. The Marauder went from being feared by its own pilots to being one of the safest rides in the skies. Still, flying it was no easy job. Marauder crews operated in tight, noisy conditions, with the aircraft's sleek fuselage leaving little room inside. Gunners manned waist positions where open windows meant freezing cold at high altitude. Bombardiers worked in a cramped glass nose, often staring straight down at flak bursts on the approach. Pilots had to wrestle the controls during formation flying, holding steady while the plane vibrated under engine strain. And of course, one wrong move on takeoff could still be fatal. Survivors recall the mixed feelings they had. Many veterans admitted they hated the B-26 during training, fearing its quirks. But once they got through a few missions, confidence grew. Some even loved the plane, praising its speed and its toughness under fire. A Marauder could get you home with a wing shot to ribbons or an engine trailing smoke, and that meant a lot when your survival depended on it. The Marauder's combat record was impressive. It flew over 110,000 sorties in Europe alone, dropping nearly 150,000 tons of bombs. In the build-up to D-Day, B-26s were used extensively to bomb railroads, bridges, and supply depots. On June 6, 1944, around 300 Marauders flew missions against German fortifications at Utah Beach, helping pave the way for the American landings. Crews from the 553rd Bomb Squadron recalled diving through clouds of flak to hit bunkers just minutes before the first waves of soldiers hit the shore. One of the most famous surviving B-26s was, quote, Dynamite, flown by Major David Dewhurst. He completed 85 combat missions during the liberation of Europe, a staggering number for any bomber pilot. While the original aircraft no longer exists, a B-26G at the Utah Beach Museum in Normandy has been repainted in tribute to Dewhurst's aircraft and his squadron's D-Day mission. By the end of the war, the Marauder had achieved something almost no one predicted. Back in 1941, it shed its deadly reputation and became a respected, even beloved aircraft. In total, about 5,300 B-26s were built. They served not just with the US, but also with the British RAF, the Free French, and the South African Air Force. Yet, unlike the B-17 or B-25, the Marauder didn't have a long post-war career. By 1947, it was retired from US service, and its designation, quote, B-26, was reassigned to the Douglas A-26 Invader. For many, this created confusion. Two completely different planes, both known as the B26. But among those who flew the Marauder in World War II, there was no confusion at all. They knew what it had been: a death trap in training, a workhorse in combat, and a bomber that proved its worth against all odds. So why was it called the, quote, "Widowmaker"? Because in its early years it killed far too many of its own. But why is it remembered? Because it overcame that reputation and became one of the most effective medium bombers of the war. And that transformation from feared killer to trusted machine is exactly why the B-26's story deserves to be remembered. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to like, subscribe, and also check out our other scripts on infamous World War II weapons. Next time, we'll be diving into another machine that terrified the men who used it. Until then, thanks for watching. And let us know in the comments, do you think the Marauder deserves more recognition alongside the B-17 and B-25?